The banker's name was on a brass plate screwed into a desk that was trying very hard to look more expensive than it was. Nora Calloway did not need to read it. She had seen that face before at the county extension office when she was 12, and her grandfather needed a soil amendment permit at the farm supply counter when she was 14, and the man behind it decided she was shopping for someone else. At every place a 19-year-old girl walks into alone and watches the room make up its mind about her in the first 4 seconds. Franklin Cross folded his hands on the desk with the particular patience of a man who has already arrived at his conclusion and is now simply waiting for the conversation to catch up. "Miss Calloway," he said, "Harlan County Agricultural Lending has worked with your grandfather's estate for 11 years. We have a great deal of respect for what your family built out there on Route 9. He paused the way people pause when the word "but" is about to do most of the work in the sentence. But a farm that size, 112 acres, an outstanding note of $41,000, and a primary residence that the county assessor flagged in October for deferred maintenance. That is not a beginner's situation. Nora had driven 40 minutes on a 2-lane road with a cracked defroster and a heater that worked better on the left side than the right. She was wearing her grandfather's barn coat, the brown canvas Carhartt with the split left elbow, and the smell that was equal parts diesel fuel, and something she could only describe as him. The coat was too wide in the shoulders and too long in the sleeves, and she had rolled the cuffs back twice, and they had come down again on the drive over. She was aware of all of this in the way you become aware of everything that makes you look young when you are trying not to. "I am not a beginner," she said. "I grew up on that land." Franklin Cross smiled, not unkindly. The smile of a man acknowledging something that is technically true but does not change the operational reality of the conversation. He explained the situation in the careful language of institutional finance, which is a language designed to make things sound inevitable rather than chosen. The farm's collateral value had been reassessed downward by 28% due to deferred maintenance on the primary structure and the flagged conditions on 2 outbuildings. Under the terms of the existing operating loan agreement, a collateral reduction of this magnitude required a formal review. The bank was not calling the note immediately. He wanted to be clear about that. But Nora had 60 days through the first week of April to provide documented evidence of the farm's productive capacity, yield records, sales history, soil assessment, something the bank could point to when it justified continuing the loan in its current form. 60 days, he said again, to demonstrate the farm is a functioning agricultural operation. Nora looked at the window behind his head. Outside, the February sky over Mill Haven, Wisconsin, was the particular white that means winter has stopped announcing itself and simply settled in for the duration. The thermometer on the bank's exterior sign read 18 degrees. She thanked him. She took the folder of documents he slid across the desk. She stood and shook his hand and walked out through the lobby and through the glass doors into the cold, and got in her grandfather's truck and sat in the parking lot for a long time before she started the engine. The farm sat at the end of a 3/4-mile gravel lane off Route 9, just outside a town called Creek Bend, Wisconsin, population 2,400. If the sign was still current, which Nora doubted. Her grandfather, Everett Calloway, had bought the 112 acres in 1979 for $60,000, which everyone at the time said was too much for hill country with that drainage situation and that soil profile. He had grown corn and soybeans on the back 40 for the first decade. He had kept a small dairy operation through the early 90s, before the economics of small-scale dairy made that impossible for anyone who wasn't already running 300 head. He had pivoted to vegetable production and direct sales in the late 90s, which most of his neighbors considered eccentric and economically irresponsible, and which had in fact kept the farm going for the 25 years since. He had died on the 4th of November the previous year, on a Tuesday between breakfast and lunch in the kitchen, where he had eaten every meal of his adult life. The county assessor had come in October. The flagged conditions were real. Everett had known about the roof over the back addition for 2 years and had been managing it the way farmers manage problems that require capital. They do not currently have with buckets and patience, and the reasonable hope that a bad winter would not become a catastrophic one. He left Nora everything: the house, the land, the equipment, the debt, and 11 laying hens that he had not named on principle because he believed that naming a chicken created a category confusion about what a chicken fundamentally was. He also left a note. It was written on the back of a seed catalog in his handwriting, which was large and slightly forward-leaning in the manner of a man who had learned to write in a different era and had never seen any reason to change. The note said, "Do not sell. Go to the cellar first." Nora had been on the farm for 4 days when Franklin Cross arrived with his folder. She had not yet gone to the cellar. The farm was in a particular kind of February stillness when she pulled back into the lane that afternoon. The fields ran flat and wide on both sides of the gravel, the snow from the previous week having settled into a crust that caught the low light and held it in a way that made the whole property look preserved. The barn was visible from the lane, dark red siding gone slightly brown with age, the metal roof carrying a ridgeline of snow that had not shifted in 3 days. Behind it, the tree line began, where the usable ground ended, and the slope dropped toward the creek that marked the northeast boundary. She sat in the truck in the yard and looked at the house. The farmhouse was white 2 stories with a covered porch along the front and a back addition that had been built sometime in the 1950s by someone who had run out of matching lumber halfway through the project. The second bedroom in the addition had the roof problem. The stain on the plaster ceiling had been spreading since October, at the pace of something patient and inevitable. She had been managing the stove wrong. She understood this because the kitchen had been cold every morning in a way it should not have been if she had banked the firebox correctly the night before. Her grandfather had known that stove the way you know a person after 30 years of mornings together. She was still learning its particular requirements: the specific amount of wood, the specific adjustment of the damper, the specific window of time in which you needed to make the decision about adding a log before the question answered itself in the wrong direction. This was the thing about the farm. Everything on it was calibrated to a person who was no longer there. The stove, the chicken routine, the specific order in which the morning tasks needed to be done to keep the whole operation from falling behind itself. She was learning it in reverse, backward engineering the logic of a life from its material remains. She was making coffee at the kitchen window when the second car arrived. She had not heard it on the lane because she had been running water. She noticed it when it was already in the yard. A dark-colored SUV that was too clean for February in Renner County. The man who got out was 55 years old or thereabouts, with the particular physical confidence of someone who had been successful for long enough that he moved through spaces as though they already belonged to him in some provisional sense. He wore a coat that cost more than Nora's tuition had before she stopped attending. He looked at the barn first before he looked at the house. He introduced himself at the door as Dean Whitfield. He said he had known her grandfather for many years. He said he understood she had inherited the property and that he wanted to talk to her about her options. He said this with the gentleness of a man who has rehearsed the approach carefully because he knows the situation is delicate. He said he would like to make her an offer for the farm. Nora looked at him standing on the porch in his coat in the February cold and thought about the folder sitting on the kitchen table. The one Franklin Cross had given her 3 hours ago. The one with the 60-day deadline written on page 4 in the language banks use when they want something to sound administrative rather than urgent. She thought about the fact that Dean Whitfield had appeared on the same day. She thought about the fact that he had looked at the barn before he looked at the house. The way people look at the valuable part of a thing before they look at the inhabited part. She said she was not interested in selling. Whitfield nodded slowly, the nod of a man who expected this answer and has factored it into his approach. He said he understood. He said the offer would remain open. He took a business card from his coat pocket and held it out. She took it. He walked back to his SUV and reversed out of the yard with the controlled precision of someone who had never slid a vehicle on farm gravel. Nora stood at the window and watched his taillights reach the road and disappear. Then, she picked up the folder from Franklin Cross and read it again carefully, all 6 pages. And when she reached page 4, she sat down at the kitchen table and stayed there for a long time. 60 days. Starting now. Starting from a farm she had been on for 4 days. Her grandfather's note was in her coat pocket. She had been carrying it since the first morning, folded into a square the size of a matchbook. The seed catalog paper going soft at the creases from the warmth of her hand. Do not sell. Go to the cellar first. She had not gone to the cellar. Not because she had forgotten and not because she was afraid of what was down there exactly. The reason was simpler and harder to explain. The note on the seed catalog was the last thing Everett Calloway had written that was meant specifically for her. Going to the cellar meant following the instruction, and following the instruction meant the note was finished. The way a letter is finished when you reach the last line and you look up from the page and the room is the same room it was before you started reading, but it feels different now because the voice that was in it is only in the paper and not anywhere else. She was not ready for that yet. She put on his barn coat and went out to check on the chickens instead. The chicken coop sat east of the barn, a small structure with a slanted roof and a south-facing window that Everett had added sometime in the 90s to give the hens natural light in winter. All 11 were present. She checked the waterer, which had frozen again overnight, and replaced the water from the heated bucket she had learned to keep in the small equipment lean-to after the first morning when she had found 11 pairs of reproachful eyes watching her from beside a solid block of ice. She checked the feed level. The feeder was lower than it should have been. She had been supplementing from a bag she found in the main equipment shed, but it was nearly empty, and she did not yet know where Everett had ordered his supply, or when the last order had been placed, or whether there was a standing arrangement with a supplier that had now, with his death, been silently interrupted. There were many things on this farm that existed inside arrangements she could not see, because the person who had made them was gone. One of the barred rocks stood apart from the others near the east wall. Nora watched her for a while. She was eating and her comb was pink, and her posture did not suggest anything conclusively wrong. Nora wrote it in her notebook anyway. She had started carrying a notebook on the second day. Green Cover College ruled the kind she had used for class notes the previous semester, before she had stopped going to class. The notes in it now were not about class. They were about fence posts and waterers and the heater cord in the small equipment shed that had a frayed section she did not trust, and the fact that the barn's main light fixture in the north section had a bulb that needed replacing, and the location of the spare bulbs in the kitchen cabinet, second shelf from the left. She went back inside and stood at the kitchen window with coffee and looked at the yard. The north bay of the barn was visible from the window, the oldest section of the structure, with the stone foundation that predated everything else on the property. On her second day, she had noticed that the door to the north bay was secured differently from the other sections. Not with the simple sliding latch that Everett used everywhere else on the farm. The latch that required two hands and a specific upward then sideways motion he had been meaning to fix for at least 5 years based on what she could see. The north bay door had a padlock, a master lock substantial, the shrouded shackle type that does not give when you push against it with rust, staining the chain links around the shackle in a way that suggested long exposure, but not recent neglect. She had found no key for it. She had looked in the kitchen drawer where every other key on the property seemed to have migrated over the years, tagged and untagged, useful and mysterious in accumulation that represented decades of locks and vehicles and outbuildings, and possibly things that no longer existed anywhere except as a key in a drawer. She had tried 17 of them on the North Bay padlock. None of them were right. She wrote North Bay key where in her notebook. She went to the mudroom because the mudroom was where the day began and ended on this farm, and because she had not yet looked at everything in it carefully, only at the things that were immediately necessary for the morning routine. The mudroom ran along the side of the house between the kitchen and the back porch door. Plank floor worn smooth in the path between the doors. A row of coat hooks, most empty now. One held a coil of baling twine. One held a canvas hat she had not moved because it still smelled faintly like him. And she was not ready to deal with that yet either. Below the hooks, someone had nailed a small wooden box to the wall. Pine, maybe 4 inches deep, with a brass hinge at the top and a small brass latch. She had looked at it on her first walk-through of the house and registered it as empty because she had lifted the lid briefly and seen nothing and moved on. She had been moving fast that day, cataloging, still in the state of mind where you look for large things and overlook the small ones. She lifted the lid again now, slower. There was a key. It was taped to the inside bottom of the box with a single strip of electrical tape that had gone brittle at the edges, the black plastic beginning to separate from the backing in the way of tape that has been in place long enough to have a history of its own. Under the key, written on a strip of masking tape pressed to the wood, was a single word in her grandfather's handwriting: North. Nora stood in the mudroom with the key in her palm for a long time. It was small brass, or once brass, the finish gone greenish at the teeth, an oval bow with nothing decorative about it. A hardware store key, the kind cut from a blank in 30 seconds. But the tape was careful. The label was careful. A man who had placed this here had thought about who would find it and what they would need to know, and had decided that one word was sufficient. He had been right about her, apparently. She put on her boots and his coat and went out. The north bay of the barn was at the back of the main structure, set slightly lower than the other 2 sections, because the ground dropped away there, where the stone foundation had been laid first, before anyone knew how large the barn would eventually become. The door was heavy board and batten construction, the boards grayed with weather. The padlock hung on a hasp at shoulder height. She put the key in. It turned on the second try, with a slight upward pressure on the body that suggested she would need to learn that particular habit to open it reliably. The shackle released with a sound like one quiet word being spoken in an empty room. She pulled the door open and stood at the threshold. The light was low. 2 small windows on the east wall, both hazed with grime, and the residue of decades admitting enough February light to see by, but not enough to see clearly. The smell reached her first. Not rot. She wanted to be specific about that because rot was what she had half expected, and rot was not what was here. This was something drier and older, dust and linseed, and something faintly resinous, like the cedar lining of a chest that had been closed for years and held its scent in the way that wood holds things given enough time. Her eyes adjusted. The floor was packed dirt, darker in the center where foot traffic had pressed it down over years, lighter at the edges where no one had walked. Against the far wall, stacked with a precision that was immediately recognizable as deliberate, were wooden crates. Thin slat construction, the kind made from apple boxes, or similar with small gaps between the boards. She counted them. 11 crates stacked in 2 columns against the wall. To the left, hanging from a single wooden peg driven into a wall stud, was a canvas apron. It was stiff with age, folded once at the waist, and holding its shape the way canvas holds shape after years of the same position. When Nora lifted it off the peg, it held its fold for a moment before settling. Across the bib and marker that had bled slightly into the fabric over the decades were 3 letters: AMC. Agnes Marie Calloway, her grandmother, the woman in the black and white photographs on Everett's desk. The woman who had died in December 1999, 2 years before Nora was born, which meant Nora had never met her and had no memory of her except secondhand, except filtered through Everett's occasional mentions and the photographs and the particular quality of silence that surrounded her name in conversations that drifted in that direction. Nora held the apron for a while. Then she crossed to the crates. They were sealed. Each one had been closed with a thin strip of wood nailed across the top, and most of those closure strips were still intact. She worked her thumbnail under the nail head of one near the bottom of the stack, the one that showed the most weathering and therefore, she reasoned, had been in place the longest. The nail gave with a dry pop. She lifted the slat and looked inside. Glass bottles, 8 of them lying on their sides in packing straw that had gone the color of old paper. Dark glass, the kind that blocks light deliberately. The corks were sealed with wax, a layer pressed down over each one and smoothed carefully at the edges. The wax had discolored over the years from whatever color it had started, as to a deep amber brown, but it was intact. She could see that from above, without touching it. Every seal she could see was whole. She lifted one bottle to the east window. The contents were visible in the pale winter light coming through the dirty glass. Deep amber, nearly the color of black tea, with a clarity that suggested careful filtering before bottling. Not cloudy, not oxidized in the way of something gone wrong, something preserved, something kept. She set the bottle back in the straw and looked at the other crates. She counted the visible bottles across all 11 crates, doing the arithmetic as she went. 8 bottles per crate, 11 crates. 88. She opened 2 more crates to confirm the count and found one with only 4 bottles and one with a full 8, which gave her 92. She found another crate at the far end of the second column that had been sealed differently from the rest, with a strip of tin rather than wood. And inside were 4 more bottles wrapped individually in what had once been burlap feed sacks. 96 bottles total. Apple wine. She understood this from the color and from the bottles themselves, which were the long-neck style used for still wines rather than the heavier bottles used for spirits, or the shorter bottles used for beer. Apple wine made from the orchard. Made in this room. Made carefully over years by a woman whose initials were on the apron hanging by the door. Against the north wall was a workbench. The surface was clear except for a single folded piece of paper, held flat by a short length of iron pipe. She crossed to it. She would come back to the paper. She knew that already. The light was too low to read it properly, and her hands were not steady enough yet for the particular patience that reading in bad light required. She was still taking in the room. What she understood, standing in the center of the packed dirt floor with the smell of old wood and linseed around her and 96 bottles of preserved apple wine behind her, was this the north bay of the barn on the Calloway property in Renner County, Wisconsin. Had been for some period of years that she could not yet determine a working production space. Small scale, deliberate, maintained with care, and completely invisible to everyone who had not been given the key to the door. Agnes Calloway had built something here. Everett Calloway had kept that secret for 23 years after his wife's death, and had then, with his last written communication to his granddaughter, directed her to the cellar first and left the key to the North Bay in a box in the mudroom, under a single word on a masking tape label, trusting that she would understand the connection when she needed to understand it. Behind the coffee can of hardware on the lowest shelf, she found the notebook, black and white marbled cover. Composition style the same kind Everett used for his equipment maintenance logs and his field yield records. This one had no label on the outside. She opened it to the first page. Inside the front cover, in her grandmother's handwriting, which she recognized from birthday cards she had found in a box in the upstairs bedroom. Cards Agnes had written and addressed and stamped, and then for reasons Nora did not yet understand, never sent in that careful, rightward slanting cursive she recognized without having known the woman who made it, was written started November 3rd, 1987. Do not scale until the apple press is repaired. Then the entries began. Nora carried the notebook to the east window where the light was best and leaned against the wall beside it and began to read. The entries were meticulous in the way of someone who understood that the difference between what worked and what did not was often a matter of specifics too small to hold in memory. Ingredients measured in grams and fractions of cups. Temperatures in Fahrenheit, with notes about the ambient temperature of the room during fermentation. Processing times and the reasoning behind adjustments between batches. The varieties of apple used and how they behaved differently in the press. How the pears from the east corner of the orchard fermented faster than any published guide suggested they should, and what she had done to account for that. There were tasting notes. They read more like field observations than descriptions of pleasure. The language of someone evaluating a living process rather than enjoying a finished product. The secondary fermentation on the Baldwin blend is forward on the acidity, adjusted sulfite addition. The Roxbury russet from the back row contributes tannin the store-bought varietals cannot replicate. Do not substitute. Nora read for 20 minutes without moving from the window. She lost track of the cold. What she had understood as she read, her grandmother had been making apple wine in this barn since November of 1987, and had been doing it with the quiet, systematic rigor of someone who takes their work seriously, regardless of whether anyone is watching. She had been recording every batch, every adjustment, every observation about how the fruit from this specific orchard on this specific hillside in Renner County, Wisconsin, behaved in this specific process. 41 pages of documentation covering at least 11 years of production. Not a hobby, not an experiment, a practice. The kind of practice that people develop when they are doing something that matters to them in a way that does not require an audience. Nora closed the notebook and looked at the 96 bottles lined up in their crates along the far wall. Her grandmother had made this, had sealed it, had stored it with care in this room and behind this door for which there was only one key. And then she had died in December of 1999 with the production logs and the bottles still here. And Everett had locked the door and carried the key and had said nothing to anyone for 23 years. Why he had not finished what Agnes had started, Nora did not yet know. Why he had kept the room exactly as Agnes had left it, untouched, sealed, waiting, she did not yet know either. What she knew was that he had written her a note on the back of a seed catalog, and she had been carrying it in her coat pocket for 4 days. And the note had said, go to the cellar first, not go to the North Bay, which meant there was another room and another thing she had not yet found. She put the notebook carefully inside her coat, pressed against her chest. She carried it the way you carry something that has crossed a significant distance to reach you. Outside, the February afternoon had advanced toward the particular pale gray that preceded dark. In this season, the sky not quite ready to let go of the light. but beginning the process of releasing it. She walked from the North Bay back across the barnyard to the house, her boots finding the same path she had made in the snow. Over 4 days of mornings, the crust broken, and then refrozen in the shape of her footsteps. Inside the kitchen, she put water on the gas range for coffee and sat at the table under the overhead light that was older than she was and waited for the water to heat. The folder from the bank was on the table. 60 days. The business card from Dean Whitfield was on the table too, set at an angle she had not meant to be significant, but which she noticed now. He had known about the bank visit. He had appeared on the same afternoon. He had looked at the barn before he looked at the house. She looked at the notebook. Agnes Calloway had hidden something in this barn for 11 years, and then died before she could do whatever she had intended to do with it. Everett had guarded that secret for 23 years. He had kept the key in a box in the mudroom with a one-word label addressed to whoever came after him. He had come home to this kitchen every morning for 23 years, and eaten breakfast at this table, and banked this stove, and walked this farm, and known that the North Bay held everything his wife had built, everything she had documented and preserved and labeled in her careful, rightward script, and he had said nothing to anyone. The water came to a boil and she poured it and sat back down. She was 19 years old. She had been on this farm for 4 days. She had a 60-day deadline from a bank that had received a visit from a property developer on the same afternoon. It sent its representative out to deliver that deadline. She had a leaking roof and 11 unnamed chickens and an empty feed sack and a stove. She had not yet learned to run correctly overnight, and she had 96 bottles of her grandmother's apple wine in a locked barn and a notebook that told her exactly how they had been made, and the specific knowledge still forming in the back of her mind that she had not yet gone to the cellar. She put her grandfather's note on the table and smoothed the folds out carefully with the heel of her hand. The seed catalog paper had gone soft from 4 days inside her coat. The handwriting was large and unhurried, and unmistakably his. Do not sell. Go to the cellar first. She picked up her notebook and her flashlight and the coffee in the white mug with the faded green stripe, the one that had been washed 10,000 times and still held its shape. And she walked to the cellar door off the kitchen and opened it and went down. The cellar ran the length of the kitchen foundation. Nora had estimated this from above, but the actual dimensions still surprised her when she reached the bottom of the stairs and swept the flashlight across the space. 18 feet by 12 stone walls laid without mortar in the way of construction that predated the understanding of concrete as a practical material for farm outbuildings. The floor was packed dirt, cold and dry, carrying the specific temperature of ground that has not seen direct sun in living memory. The air tasted of mineral cold and something older, the accumulated breath of a space that had been used and sealed and used again across multiple generations. Along the east wall were the mason jars she had expected, her grandfather's handwriting on the lids in his marker dates and contents in the shorthand of someone who trusted his own memory to fill in the rest. Tomatoes from last August, green beans in 3 different sizes of jar, pickled beets in colors that caught the flashlight beam like stained glass, deep red and purple, and the particular amber of beets that had been in the jar long enough to mellow. Applesauce, corn relish. The preserved record of a summer's work put down for winter used the same practice that had fed people in this part of Wisconsin since before the county had its name. But along the north wall, behind a shelf of empty canning lids, still in their cardboard sleeves, there were 8 wooden cases stacked too high, different from the crates in the North Bay. These were proper wine cases, 12-bottle capacity, the kind made from pine with a sliding top panel. Each panel had been sealed with a thin bead of carpenter's glue along the edge and pressed shut while it dried. The glue had gone amber with age, but it had held. Nora crouched in front of the lowest case and worked her thumbnail along the seal until it gave in a thin line. She slid the panel back, dark glass bottles lying on their sides in sawdust packing, corks sealed with wax over the top, same method as the bottles in the North Bay, same amber-brown color of old wax that had done its job for years. She lifted one bottle carefully and held it in the flashlight beam, the same deep color as the North Bay bottles, full, heavy with the specific weight of something that had been kept a long time. She counted the cases, 8 of them, 12 bottles each, 96 bottles in the North Bay and 96 bottles in the cellar, 192 bottles of apple wine sealed and preserved in 2 separate locations on the same property, made by the same woman, guarded by the same man for 23 years. Nora sat down on the cellar stairs and held the flashlight pointing at the floor, and stayed there for a while. She thought about her grandfather eating breakfast at the kitchen table every morning for 23 years directly above 96 bottles of his dead wife's apple wine. She thought about the key in the box in the mudroom with the one-word label. She thought about the note on the seed catalog in her coat pocket. Do not sell. Go to the cellar first. He had wanted her to find both. He had arranged for her to find both in sequence, beginning with the cellar. Not because the cellar was more important, but because the cellar was under the house she lived in, and the North Bay was in the barn she would have to choose to enter. He had wanted the first discovery to come to her before she had to go looking for the second one. That was how Everett Callaway had organized things, in the sequence that made the most sense for the person who was going to need to understand them. She carried the notebook back upstairs with her. At the kitchen table in the overhead light, she opened it to where she had left off and kept reading. The early entries were technical and methodical, the record of someone refining a process across batches and years. The middle section had more of Agnes's voice in it, observations about how different harvest years produced different results, how the apples from the north row of the orchard tasted different from the south row in the press, and how she had learned to blend them rather than process them separately. Notes about the particular character of the Roxbury russet, a variety old enough that most commercial operations had stopped growing it because it did not produce the consistent high yield that modern agriculture required. Agnes grew them for a different reason. They contributed something to the finished wine that no other apple in the orchard contributed, a specific tannic structure that she described in one entry as the thing that makes it last. She had known she was making something meant to last. The later entries were different. The handwriting changed in the final third of the notebook, tighter and more deliberate, the letters taking up less space on each line, in the way that happens when a person has become aware of the limits of the page. The dates were further apart, weeks between some entries, a month in one gap. The tone had shifted from technical observation to something else, a register she recognized without being able to name it. Exactly the voice of someone closing up for winter but writing it down first. The second to last entry was dated November 14th. Nora checked the year against the internal chronology she had been building from the dates in the notebook, and understood that this entry was from the winter before Agnes died. Agnes had written about the wine in the cellar in a specific way that appeared nowhere in the earlier entries, not as product, not as process, as something finished. She had listed quantities and vintages in the careful columns she used for yield records, and below the columns she had written a single line in smaller script, almost as a note to herself. Seals checked. Wax still solid. The cold will hold them. She had known. She had checked every bottle and recorded that they were still good, and noted that the conditions of the cellar would maintain them. Nora wrote those words in her own notebook. The cold will hold them. The last entry was 12 days later, November 26th. It was shorter than anything in the previous 40 pages. Agnes had written about the orchard, specifically about one tree at the far eastern edge of the planting. The oldest one, the one with the split trunk that had healed over the years, into a shape that looked like two trees that had decided to become one. Agnes wrote that she believed the tree had been there when her own mother was a girl, which put its age at somewhere over 90 years. She hoped it lasted another 90. Then the sentence ended without a period. The line trailed off into blank paper. 30 blank pages followed. Nora sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open to the last page Agnes had written, and looked at those 30 empty pages for a long time. She had been treating the notebook as a technical document, which it was. A record of methodology and process, which she could use, which she intended to use. But sitting at the table in the February night with the notebook in her hands, she understood that she had been reading it wrong or only partly right. It was a technical document. It was also a letter addressed to no specific person, addressed to whoever came next, and was willing to sit with it long enough to reach the end. She was the one who had come next. She turned back to the last entry and read it again slowly. Then she turned to the inside back cover, a habit from her own notebooks where she sometimes put things she wanted to keep but didn't know where else to put. Something was there, a folded piece of paper tucked into the fold of the back cover, held in place by its own compression against the cardboard. She had not seen it when she first opened the notebook, because she had opened to the front and read forward, and had not yet reached the back. She took it out carefully. The paper was different from the notebook pages. Heavier official stock folded into thirds in the standard way of correspondence. It had been in the notebook long enough that the folds had relaxed into permanent creases. She opened it. It was a letter, dated September 18th, 1998. The letterhead read, Wisconsin Agricultural Heritage Society, and below the name a mailing address in Madison, and a line that read, Preserving the Methods of Wisconsin's Agricultural Tradition. The letter was addressed to Agnes Calloway at the Route 9 address. Nora read it twice before she trusted what she was understanding. The Wisconsin Agricultural Heritage Society was a private organization. The letter explained dedicated to identifying and documenting traditional agricultural practices that were at risk of disappearing from the regional landscape. A representative had visited Agnes in August of that year, following a referral from the Rainier County Agricultural Extension Office, which had heard about her apple wine production through the kind of rural information network that moves slower than the internet, but misses very little. The representative had observed Agnes's production methods, reviewed her documentation, and assessed the product against the Society's criteria for heritage agricultural practices. The Society wished to inform Agnes that her production methods, specifically the use of heritage varietal apples grown on the original orchard established by the property's first agricultural owners, the traditional still fermentation process, developed and refined over 11 years of documented practice, and the quality and character of the finished product, as assessed by the Society's evaluators, met the criteria for recognition as a Wisconsin heritage agricultural practice. Formal recognition would allow her product to be sold under the heritage designation, which carried specific legal protections under Wisconsin Agricultural Conservation Statute and exempted heritage-designated products from certain commercial regulation that applied to standard small-batch production operations. The Society was prepared to issue the formal certification upon receipt of one additional document, an independent laboratory analysis of the product confirming composition within the parameters established for the heritage designation. Agnes had never sent it. Nora read the letter a third time more slowly. She looked at the date. September 1998. Agnes had died in December 1999. 15 months between receiving this letter and dying. 15 months in which she could have sent a bottle to a laboratory, received an analysis, and submitted it to complete the certification. She had not done it. The question sat in the kitchen with Nora for several minutes. She thought about the later entries in the notebook, the tighter handwriting and the further apart dates. She thought about someone who is running out of page and does not quite know it yet. She thought about the specific quality of the last entry, the sentence that ended without a period, the line that simply stopped. She thought about the 30 blank pages that followed. Then she thought about Everett. He had lived in this house for 23 years after Agnes died. He had eaten breakfast above the cellar. He had kept the key to the north bay in the box in the mudroom. He had known about the wine and about the room and about the notebook. He had organized all of it, maintained all of it, locked it, and labeled it, and left it intact. But she did not believe he had known about this letter. If Everett had known that Agnes was within one laboratory analysis of formal recognition for her life's work, he would have sent that bottle himself. He was not a man who left things undone when he knew what doing them required. He would have gone to the extension office and asked which laboratory, and he would have shipped a bottle in February when the work was slow and paid whatever it cost, and sent the results to Madison and gotten his wife's work recognized. He had not done that, which meant he had not known. Agnes had received the letter in September and put it in the notebook and had meant to tell Everett when the right moment came. And the right moment had not come before the winter. That was her last one, and the sentence had ended without a period, and the letter had stayed in the notebook for 24 years. Nora set the letter on the table beside the notebook, and beside the folder from the bank, and beside Dean Whitfield's business card. She picked up her green notebook and wrote down the name of the organization and the address from the letterhead and the date of the letter, and the specific requirement that remained unmet. One laboratory analysis. Then she went to bed. She was up before 5 the following morning, not because she had slept enough, but because the farm required it. She rebuilt the fire correctly this time, having finally understood the damper relationship and the specific window for adding the overnight log. She made coffee and went out to the chickens in the dark with her flashlight, finding the yard in the particular pre-dawn stillness of a Wisconsin February when the temperature had dropped overnight and everything had gone very quiet. The cold pressing the sound out of the air, the way a hand presses water from a cloth. She was back inside with fresh eggs and a notebook full of morning observations when she heard the vehicle in the lane. It was 7:15, too early for a social call, too deliberate in its arrival for something accidental. Dean Whitfield's SUV came into the yard and parked in the same spot as before. He got out, and this time there was another man with him, someone Nora did not recognize, wearing a county-issued jacket and carrying a clipboard in the specific way of someone who carries clipboards professionally. The second man introduced himself at the door as a compliance officer from the Wisconsin Department of Revenue Alcohol and Tobacco Division. He said his office had received an anonymous complaint about the production and storage of unlicensed fermented beverage products at this property address. He said state law required them to investigate any such complaint within 30 days. He said the investigation itself was administrative and not necessarily adversarial, but that during the period of investigation, any commercial activity related to the products in question was suspended pending resolution. He said this in the neutral tone of a man reading from a procedure rather than making a decision. Whitfield stood behind the compliance officer on the porch and did not say anything. He did not need to say anything. He had the specific stillness of a man who has set something in motion and is now observing its operation from a comfortable distance. Nora looked at the compliance officer's clipboard. She looked at Whitfield. She said, "What is the resolution process?" The officer explained. If the investigation found the products to be produced in compliance with existing regulations or exempt from them by applicable statute, the matter would be closed. If a violation was confirmed, civil penalties would apply ranging from $15,000 to $50,000 depending on the scale and duration of the activity. If the violation was unresolved, the products could be subject to seizure, Whitfield said quietly from his position behind the officer. I want you to know, my offer still stands until the end of the week. The compliance officer looked briefly at Whitfield with an expression that suggested he did not entirely approve of that statement being made in the context of his official visit. Nora said nothing for a moment. Then she said, I will be in touch with your office this week. The officer left his card. He walked back to the SUV. Whitfield followed him unhurried with the ease of someone who believes he is watching. Events proceed in the direction he has arranged for them to proceed. He got in. They drove out. Nora stood at the kitchen window and watched the SUV reach the county road and turn south toward town. She picked up her notebook and opened to a fresh page. She wrote down the date and the name of the compliance officer and his agency and what he had said, and the specific language about the anonymous complaint. Then she wrote in capital letters because she had learned in her first semester of college, before she stopped attending, that the act of writing something in capital letters changes its weight in the brain. Anonymous. She thought about who had known what and when. She thought about the timeline. Franklin Cross had arrived on February 8th with the loan review document. Whitfield had arrived the same afternoon with his offer. That sequence suggested Whitfield had known about the bank review before it happened, which suggested a relationship between the information available to the bank and the information available to Whitfield. She did not know that for certain. She knew it as a pattern. Now Whitfield had arrived again with a compliance officer and an anonymous complaint about unlicensed fermented beverage production at this address. The complaint had been filed by someone who knew that there were fermented beverage products here. Nora had been on the farm for 8 days. She had not told anyone about the North Bay or the cellar. Whitfield had looked at the barn. He had looked at it specifically and first. She wrote, he was at the barn before he came to the door. She sat with that for a while. Then she opened the Agnes notebook to the letter from the Wisconsin Agricultural Heritage Society and read the relevant section again. Heritage-designated products were exempt from certain commercial regulation that applied to standard small-batch production operations under Wisconsin Agricultural Conservation Statute. She did not know which statute. She did not know what certain meant in that sentence. She did not know if the exemption applied to a product that had not yet received the designation, or only after designation was formally issued. She needed to know these things. She called the number on the card that Ruth Mercer at the county agricultural office had given her 2 days ago, when Nora had come in to ask about direct sales licensing, and Ruth had spent 40 minutes walking her through the relevant regulations and written down 3 numbers before she left. Ruth answered on the second ring. Nora explained the situation plainly, starting with the North Bay and ending with the compliance officer's visit that morning. She left out Whitfield's name for the moment. She described the letter from the Wisconsin Agricultural Heritage Society and what it said about the heritage designation and the exemption. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How old is the wine?" "Some of it is from as early as 1991, Nora said. Ruth said, "And it is still in good condition." Nora said she believed so. Another pause. Then Ruth said she was going to give Nora a 4th number. A woman named Carla DeVore, who worked for the Wisconsin Agricultural Heritage Society in Madison and had been with them for over 20 years. She said to call Carla directly and to tell her exactly what she had told Ruth, starting from the letter, Nora called Carla DeVore from the porch in the February cold, standing in her grandfather's coat, with her notebook open and her pen ready. Carla DeVore had the telephone manner of someone who handles inquiries about complex historical matters regularly and has learned to find the useful information inside any amount of surrounding detail. She listened without interrupting while Nora described Agnes's production records, the bottles in the North Bay and the cellar, and the 1998 letter in the back of the notebook. When Nora finished, Carla asked, "Do you have the original letter in front of you?" Nora did. Carla asked her to read the reference number from the letterhead. Nora read it. There was a pause during which Nora heard keyboard sounds. Carla said, "We have a file. The original inquiry is still in the archive. Correspondence with Agnes Calloway, Rainier County, 1998. The file is marked incomplete pending laboratory analysis submission." Nora stood very still on the porch. She said, "The file is still active." Carla said, "We do not close incomplete heritage files. The work Agnes Calloway did has not changed because she is no longer here. The record exists. The methodology is documented. What is missing is the laboratory analysis." Nora looked out across the February fields. The sky was lightening toward noon, though noon in February in Wisconsin looked very much like late afternoon everywhere else. She said, "If I submit the laboratory analysis, can the certification be completed?" Carla said, "If the product meets the parameters, the file can be completed in the name of the original applicant and the certification can be transferred to the current property owner as legal heir." Yes. Nora wrote this down word by word. Then she said, "And the exemption from commercial regulation." Carla said, "The statute is still in effect. Heritage-designated products produced on the original property using the documented traditional methods are exempt from standard small-batch commercial licensing requirements under Section 94.67 of Wisconsin Agricultural Code. They are not exempt from TTB federal regulations, but federal cottage production thresholds are separate and generous." "What is the anticipated annual production volume?" Nora did the arithmetic she had been doing in her head since the cellar. She described the current inventory without committing to a number about future production. Carla said, "For the existing inventory, the heritage designation, if it applies, would mean the existing products were produced under a recognized heritage practice at the time of their production. The compliance question would be covered under the same exemption retroactively. It is the nature of heritage certification that it applies to the practice, not just to future production." Nora stood on the porch in the cold for a moment after the call ended. She thought about the compliance officer's clipboard and the word anonymous and the specific language about commercial activity being suspended pending resolution. She went back inside and found the compliance officer's card and called his office number. She explained that she was following up on the investigation opened that morning. She said she believed the products in question might be covered under the Heritage Agricultural Practice exemption in Section 94.67, and that she was in the process of completing a heritage certification that had been initiated by the original producer in 1998. She asked whether the investigation could be held in abeyance pending the outcome of the certification process. The compliance officer was not unkind. He said he would need to review the statute she cited and consult with his supervisor. He said the investigation timeline was 30 days. If she could provide documentation of the pending certification, within that window the investigation would likely be stayed pending resolution of the certification. 30 days. Her bank deadline was in 22. She started the laboratory process that afternoon. The agricultural laboratory at the University of Wisconsin in Madison had a submission process she found on their website after 2 hours of navigation that should have taken 20 minutes. She called the number listed for sample submissions and reached a graduate student in the enology program who told her more in 15 minutes than she could have learned in 2 hours of reading. She needed a sample of at least 100 milliliters per vintage to be tested. She needed to include the production documentation, meaning Agnes's notebook or copies of the relevant pages. The standard turnaround was 10 business days, but expedited processing was available for an additional fee. She paid the fee. She spent the following morning photographing every page of Agnes's notebook with her phone, the photographs clear enough to read every entry. She packaged 3 bottles, one from the 1991 vintage, and one from 1994, and one from 1997, in cardboard wrapped with a sweater, and addressed the package to the laboratory at the university. She drove to Mill Haven and shipped it overnight. Then she came home and stood in the North Bay for a long time. The room was unchanged. The crates along the wall, the apron on its peg, the smell of linseed and old wood, and the specific dry cold of a space that had been sealed against the weather for years. 96 bottles in their packing straw sealed with Agnes's wax, carrying 24 years of cellar time, and whatever that had done to them. Nora did not know if the wine was still good. She had believed it from looking at the sealed bottles in the undisturbed cold, and Carla DeVore had said that the cellar conditions as Nora described them were consistent with long-term preservation of still wines with high tannin structure. But believing was not knowing. The laboratory would tell her what the bottles actually contained, and whether that matched what Agnes had documented, and whether it met the parameters the society required. She had done what she could do. She had moved in the directions that were available to move. Now she needed to wait. She was not good at waiting in the way that some people are not good at waiting. Not because she was impatient, but because waiting required tolerating uncertainty. And she had discovered in the 8 days she had been on this farm that she was better at uncertainty when her hands were doing something. So she worked. She repaired the heater cord in the small equipment shed and replaced the light fixture bulb in the north barn section. She drove to the feed supply in Mill Haven and established an account and arranged delivery of the scratch grain her grandfather had been ordering, and confirmed that the standing order had lapsed with his death, and set up a new one. She read 3 sections of the lease agreement for the back 40 which Everett had been renting to a neighboring operation for hay production, and called the operation to confirm the arrangement was continuing. She walked the fence line along the east boundary on a day when the temperature rose above freezing for 3 hours, and found 4 posts that would need resetting before spring. She wrote them in her notebook with their approximate locations. She went to the county extension office and spent an afternoon with Ruth Mercer, working through the direct sales licensing process for farmers markets in Rainier County and the 3 adjacent counties. Ruth asked about the certification process, and Nora told her where it stood. Ruth said she would make a call to a contact at the state agricultural department and ask whether the pending certification could be noted in the licensing application as supporting documentation. Nora thanked her. Ruth looked at her for a moment in the specific way of someone who has worked with farmers for 30 years and has learned to read the difference between people who are managing and people who are doing more than managing. She said, "Your grandfather came in here every spring for 20 years. He was not a man who asked for help easily." She paused. "You are not either. That is not always a flaw. But the people in this office are not your adversaries." Nora said she understood. She drove home in the early dark with the truck heater running warm on the left side, and the cracked defroster doing its partial job, and the Rainier County fields running white on both sides of the county road. 8 days after she shipped the sample, the telephone rang at 7 in the morning. The woman on the line introduced herself as Dr. Pamela Strand from the University Enology Laboratory in Madison. She said she was calling about the Callaway sample submission and that she wanted to speak directly rather than send a written report because the results warranted some explanation. Nora sat down at the kitchen table. Dr. Strand said the laboratory analysis had confirmed that all 3 samples were chemically stable, structurally intact, and within the parameters established for heritage wine products. The sealing method Agnes had used and the cellar conditions Nora had described had done precisely what Agnes had written in her notebook that they would do. The cold had held them. Then she said, "I want to tell you something about the 1991 sample specifically." Nora waited. Dr. Strand said that apple wines of this type made from high-tannin heritage varieties using traditional methods had a documented capacity to develop complexity through long bottle aging, in the way that most modern fruit wines did not. Because most modern fruit wines use commercial yeast strains and production shortcuts that eliminated the structural compounds necessary for long-term development. Agnes had not used those shortcuts. She had used the specific varietals and the specific methods she had documented over 11 years of refinement. The 1991 sample had undergone a secondary fermentation process during its storage years, a natural and desirable development that the structural composition of the original product had made possible. The result, Dr. Strand said, was a wine that was not merely still good after 30 years. It was better than it had been when it was bottled. Nora looked out the kitchen window at the snow-covered orchard. She thought about Agnes writing "Do not scale until the apple press is repaired" in November of 1987. She thought about the tasting notes that read like field observations. She thought about the entry that said the Roxbury russet contributed tannin the store-bought varietals could not replicate. Do not substitute. Agnes had known what she was building. She had understood the structure she was creating and had made every decision in service of that structure, including the decision to use the old trees that nobody else was growing anymore because they did not produce the right yield for modern operations. She had built something meant to last. And then she had lasted long enough to see that it would. And then she had not lasted quite long enough to see it finished. Dr. Strand asked if Nora was planning to submit the results to the Heritage Society. Nora said she was. Dr. Strand said, "There is one more thing." She paused. "We occasionally identify products through this laboratory that we believe merit recognition beyond the scope of our standard analysis. The Wisconsin Heritage Agricultural Products Fair is held every October. It is not a commercial event. It is a recognition event organized by the Heritage Society and the University Extension for Agricultural Products with documented traditional heritage. Entries are evaluated blind by a panel that includes both scientific evaluators and heritage agricultural specialists. The deadline for the October fair is August 15th. She gave Nora the contact information for the fair registration. After the call ended, Nora sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. Outside, the February morning had advanced toward the particular brightness that comes after a cold night, when the sun hits fresh snow at a low angle and the whole landscape reflects it, back in a way that is almost too much light to look at directly. The orchard was visible from the window, the bare apple trees standing in their rows. The oldest one at the far eastern edge, identifiable even at this distance by the split trunk that had healed into a single form. Agnes had hoped it would last another 90 years. It was still there. Nora opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date and the name of the fair and the August deadline and the contact information in the careful columns she had developed over 3 weeks of morning notes on this farm. She wrote the laboratory results in the same columns. She wrote what Dr. Strand had said about the 1991 vintage. Then she looked at Dean Whitfield's business card still sitting on the table. She picked it up and turned it over. On the back, in his handwriting from the day he left it, he had written the date of his offer. and a number with several zeros and the phrase, "good through end of week." That week had been 3 weeks ago. She set the card face down on the table and put her coffee mug on top of it and opened Agnes's notebook to the page she had been reading the previous night. The page with the first detailed entry about the Baldwin and Roxbury blend, and she read it in the morning light. The way you read something when you are beginning to understand not just what it says, but what the person who wrote it understood when they wrote it. Outside, the compliance investigation clock was running. The bank deadline was in 12 days. Dean Whitfield was somewhere in Renner County making his next decision about how to proceed with a property that had not responded to his first 2 approaches the way he had expected. And in the cellar and the north bay of a barn on a 112-acre farm on Route 996, bottles in each location, waited in the specific patience of things that have been kept correctly for a long time, made by a woman who had understood something about structure and time that most people in her county had not thought worth understanding, sealed against the years by her own careful hands, better now than they had been the day she put them down. Carla DeVore was 61 years old and had worked for the Wisconsin Agricultural Heritage Society for 23 of them, which meant she had been there since before the organization had a proper office and had watched it grow from a filing cabinet in a shared space in Madison into something with actual staff and an actual archive and an actual presence in the conversations that shaped how Wisconsin thought about what its agricultural past was worth preserving. She had handled hundreds of heritage inquiries across those years, farms and orchards and dairy operations and seed-saving practices and traditional cheese-making methods that had survived in individual families while the industry around them standardized into something that produced more and remembered less. She had never driven to a farm for an intake meeting before. She had always done them by phone or by mail or in recent years by video call. She drove to Renner County on a Thursday morning in the first week of March because the file in her archive with Agnes Calloway's name on it was 24 years old, and because the voice of the 19-year-old on the phone had carried something she recognized from her 2 decades of this work. Not urgency, not desperation, but the specific quality of someone who has found something important and is trying to understand its full dimensions before they do anything with it. She arrived at the farm at 10 in the morning. The lane was still frozen at the edges but passable. She parked in the yard and sat for a moment looking at the barn, the way people look at structures that are older than they appear when you first pull up. Taking in the stone foundation of the north section, and the way the building sat slightly lower on that end, where the original ground had shaped the original building, before anyone thought about what would come after it. Nora met her at the door in the barn coat. They sat at the kitchen table with the Agnes notebook open between them and Carla's own folder open beside it, inside which was a photocopy of the original 1998 correspondence from the Society's archive. The inquiry form Agnes had submitted the visit report from the Society representative who had come to the farm in August of that year, and the letter of pending certification that Nora had found in the notebook's back cover. Carla looked at the original letter beside the photocopy from her file. She said, "These are the same document." Nora said yes. Carla turned to the first page of Agnes's notebook and read several entries without speaking. She turned to the middle section. She read the tasting notes. She turned to the final pages and read the late entries with the tighter handwriting and the further apart dates. She found the last entry and read it, and looked at the line that ended without a period and at the 30 blank pages that followed. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she knew what she had. Nora said she wrote about the Roxbury russet trees. She said the tannin structure was what would make it last. Carla looked at the notebook in the way of someone who has spent a career reading documents and knows the difference between documentation and testimony. She said, The visit report from 1998 says the same thing. Our representative noted the heritage varietal composition as the primary distinguishing factor. The notation says it could age exceptionally if conditions were maintained. She closed her folder. She said she never told anyone she had submitted this inquiry. Nora said, "I think she was waiting until it was finished to tell my grandfather." Carla looked at her. Nora said, "The letter arrived in September. She died in December. The notebook entries after September are shorter, further apart. I think she was not well, and did not know it yet, or knew it and did not want to name it." She put the letter in the back of the notebook. She would have gotten to it. Carla was quiet again. Outside, the late winter morning moved across the snow-covered fields in the particular silence of farm country, when the wind has stopped, and nothing is working yet, because the ground is still frozen. She said, "The certification process from here forward is straightforward. We have the original file, the methodology documentation, and now we have the laboratory results from Dr. Strand. What we need is a formal transfer of the application from the original applicant to the current property owner, and a confirmation statement that the production methods documented in the file are consistent with what was found on the property." She took a form from her folder and set it on the table. Nora read it. She signed where indicated. Carla witnessed and countersigned. Carla said, "The Society will issue the certification within 10 business days. The heritage designation under Wisconsin Statute 94.67 will apply to all products produced on this property, using the documented methods including the existing inventory. The exemption from standard commercial licensing requirements will be effective upon issuance." She put the signed form back in her folder. Then she picked up the Agnes notebook one more time and opened it to the last entry. She read the final line again. She looked at the 30 blank pages. She said, "In 23 years, I have completed a lot of these files." She closed the notebook and set it gently on the table. "This one is different." She drove back to Madison that afternoon. Nora called the compliance officer's office the following morning and provided the certification reference number Carla had given her and the specific statutory citation. The compliance officer said he would forward the information to his supervisor and that she could expect a written confirmation within 5 business days, that the investigation had been stayed pending certification. He said it in the tone of someone reading from a decision that had already been made above his level. The written confirmation arrived on a Tuesday. The investigation was closed. The same week, Franklin Cross called from the bank. He said he had been informed of the heritage certification status by the county agricultural office. He said the Society's designation changed the collateral assessment substantially because a heritage-certified product with documented provenance going back to 1987 had a quantifiable market value that the bank's assessors had not previously been able to account for. He said the loan review was being resolved in her favor, and the operating note was being continued without modification. He said this in the careful language of institutional finance, which was a language Nora had been learning to translate over the past 6 weeks. What it said, stripped of the careful language, was that the bank was not going to take the farm. She thanked him and set the phone down and stood at the kitchen window for a long time. The fields were still white. The orchard was still bare. The north bay door was still visible from the window, the padlock hanging open now on its hasp, the way she had started leaving it, because there was no longer any reason to keep it locked. She went out to the orchard that afternoon and walked the rows in her grandfather's coat. The trees were dormant in the way of late winter, the branches carrying their specific structural patience, the whole form of each tree organized around the long work of producing what it produced, and then resting and then doing it again in the cycle that had been operating in this orchard since before Agnes, since before Everett, since before the property had been in the Callaway name at all. She stopped at the oldest tree at the far eastern edge. The split trunk healed into a single form, the bark carrying the specific texture of age, ridged and gray-brown, the kind of surface that takes decades to develop. Agnes had written that she believed the tree had been there when her own mother was a girl. If Agnes had been born in the early 1940s and her mother had been a girl in the early 1920s, the tree was at least 100 years old, possibly more. Nora put her hand against the bark. She stood there for a while. Then she walked back to the house and began the paperwork for direct sales licensing at the Renner County Farmers Market and 2 of the adjacent county markets for the spring season. The matter of Dean Whitfield resolved itself in the second week of March, and it resolved the way that matters resolve when you pay attention to the specific details of how a thing happened, rather than only to the fact that it happened. Nora had been thinking about the anonymous complaint since the morning the compliance officer had arrived with Whitfield behind him. She had noted at the time that the language of the complaint, which the officer had read to her from his clipboard, in the neutral, bureaucratic manner of someone conveying information, rather than making an argument, used specific terminology that she had not expected an anonymous complaint to contain. The complaint had described the products as still fermented apple wine produced from heritage varietal stock, not homemade wine, not suspected alcohol production, still fermented apple wine from heritage varietal stock. That language required knowledge, specific knowledge of what was in the North Bay and in the cellar, and of the nature of the production process, knowledge that could not have come from driving past the property or from general awareness of its history. It was the language of someone who had either seen the production space or had read documentation that described it. Whitfield had looked at the barn before he came to the door on the first visit. Nora did not know if he had been in the North Bay. She did not know if the padlock had been opened by someone with a key she did not know existed, or by another method, or if the knowledge had come through a different channel entirely. What she knew was that the specific language of the complaint matched the specific character of what was actually in that room, and that the only person outside the family who had shown direct and specific interest in the property and its barn structures was Dean Whitfield. She brought this observation to Ruth Mercer on a Wednesday afternoon. She described it carefully, without accusation, laying out the specific language of the complaint, as she had written it in her notebook immediately after the compliance officer's visit, and noting its specificity against what could have been known through ordinary means. She noted the timing of Whitfield's arrival on the day of the bank review. She noted that he had looked at the barn first. Ruth listened in the careful way of someone who has spent a career in county offices and understands the difference between a complaint that is an allegation and an observation that is a pattern. She was quiet for a moment after Nora finished. Then she said, "You are not making a formal complaint right now." Nora said, "I am making an observation about a pattern of events and asking whether there is an appropriate way to note that observation in the formal record of the compliance investigation." Ruth said, "The compliance investigation has been closed." Nora said, "Yes." Ruth looked at her for a moment with the specific expression of someone deciding how much to say. She said, "Dean Whitfield has a development project pending county approval, a lakeside resort development on the north end of the county. It has been before the County Land Use Committee for 2 years. The vote is scheduled for April." Nora said nothing. Ruth said, "County Land Use Committees do not formally consider the character of applicants. They consider the merits of the project. But the committee members are county residents, and they receive information through the same networks that all county residents use." She picked up her pen. She said, "I am going to make a note in the county agricultural office file for this property. The note will reflect that the anonymous complaint filed against this address in February of this year used specific technical language consistent with knowledge of the property's interior agricultural operations knowledge that was not publicly available. The note will be factual and will cite the specific language from the compliance record. She wrote something in the file on her desk. She said, "County records are public documents." Nora thanked her and drove home. She did not know what Ruth's note would produce, or whether it would produce anything. She was not in the business of predicting how information moved through the specific social and professional networks of Renner County, Wisconsin. She was 19 years old and had been in this county for 6 weeks and did not pretend to understand its internal workings at the level that a 30-year county employee understood them. What she understood was that she had found the pattern and named it in the right place and in the right manner. What happened after that was not entirely in her hands, which was a condition she was learning to accept on this farm, where the results of most work took longer to appear than the work itself took to do. In April, the County Land Use Committee voted against Whitfield's Lakeside Resort project. The vote was 4-1. The committee's written decision cited concerns about the environmental impact assessment and the adequacy of the drainage plan for the North Shore parcels. It did not cite character. It cited plans. Nora heard about the vote from Hank down at the feed supply, who mentioned it in the tone of someone reporting local news without particular emotion. He said Whitfield had been working that project for 2 years and was not going to walk away from it easily, but that the committee had not been receptive to the most recent revision either. Nora listened and paid for her order and drove home. She did not feel triumph. What she felt was something more modest than triumph and more durable, the specific quiet of a situation that has been correctly handled, rather than dramatically won. She had found the pattern and named it in the right place, in the right way, and then returned to the work that was waiting to be done, which was what the farm required of her every day, regardless of what else was happening around it. She planted the kitchen garden in April when the ground was workable. She put in the early crops her grandfather had always put in: spinach and peas and the cold hardy lettuces that could go in before the last frost, if you paid attention to the specific microclimate of each bed. She prepared the main market garden beds through April and May, working the soil the way Everett had worked it, with attention to the specific drainage patterns of the hillside and the specific behavior of the soil in different sections of the field. The soil in the back sections, the ones her grandmother had composted heavily, before she became unable to manage the work herself, still behaved differently from the rest. More structured, better moisture retention. The carrots she planted there in May came up with a depth of color that made her stop and look at them. The specific orange-red of carrots grown in ground that has been properly built up over years. She thought about Agnes composting those sections for 8 years. She thought about work that took 8 years to complete and another 20 years to be appreciated, and the specific patience that both of those timelines required. She attended the Renner County Farmers Market for the first time as a vendor on a Saturday in late May. She had a table and a canopy and 3 crates of produce and a sign she had made herself on cardboard with her grandfather's marker writing large. The way he had written large, the forward-leaning letters that looked like his, if you did not know hers. The sign said, Callaway Farm, Creek Bend, Route 9. By 11 in the morning, she had sold everything she had brought. A woman who ran a farmstead shop in the next county had been at the market that morning and had found her table and had asked about wholesale. Nora took her number. She was not ready for wholesale yet. She was not ready to commit to quantities she was not certain she could reliably produce in this first season. But she wrote the number in her notebook. On a Tuesday in June, she drove to Madison for the first time since returning from Ithaca to meet with Carla DeVore at the Society's office and complete the paperwork for entering the existing wine inventory into the October fair. The office was on a side street near the university, a two-story building that had been a house at some point before it became an office with the specific character of spaces that hold accumulated work, rather than displaying it. Carla's office had bookshelves along two walls and a filing cabinet system that appeared to be organized in a way that made sense to Carla, and possibly only to Carla. On the wall behind her desk was a framed photograph of an orchard in winter, taken from the perspective of someone standing at the edge of the rows, looking down their length, the bare branches repeating against a gray sky in the way of things that have been placed carefully, and then simply been what they are for a long time. They worked through the entry forms for 90 minutes. Carla explained the fair evaluation process. Blind tasting by a panel of 5 evaluators, a mix of enology professionals and heritage agricultural specialists. Entries were identified by number only during evaluation. No names, no farm origins, no producer history. The evaluators received only the product itself. After the blind evaluation, if a product received recognition, the name of the original producer was announced. Not the current owner. The original producer. This was a specific rule of the Heritage Fair established in the Society's charter, reflecting the principle that heritage recognition honored the person who had developed and documented the practice regardless of who currently held the property. Nora understood what this meant. If Agnes's wine received recognition at the October Fair, the name that would be announced was Agnes Marie Calloway. She signed the entry forms. She drove back to Renner County through the June fields, the corn just beginning to show in the rows on both sides of the highway, the particular green of early June that made the landscape look new, even when the landscape was 100 years old. She worked through the summer. The direct sales at the farmers' markets were building steadily. She had expanded to 2 markets by July, adding the Mill Haven Saturday market to the Creek Bend Friday market. And the Callaway farm table was developing the kind of quiet, regular clientele that builds when people trust what they are buying and come back for it. She was not making large amounts of money. She was making enough which, in the context of this farm's particular financial history, was a different category from enough than it looked like from the outside. She learned the orchard through the summer. She pruned in late June, where the winter damage had left crossed branches cutting in the careful way that Everett had shown her years ago, when she was young enough to not quite understand why it mattered. She thinned the fruit in July on the heavier-bearing trees, taking off the excess, so the remaining fruit developed properly. She watched the Roxbury russets through August, the old variety in the far rows, the ones Agnes had documented in the notebook, as the source of the structure that made the wine last. They were carrying fruit this year, more than she had expected from trees of their age. The apples were not large, but they were dense, and their color was the specific reddish-green of a variety that had not been selected for supermarket appearance and did not try to look like anything except what it was. She made a note in her notebook. The Roxbury russets in the far row are carrying well this year, more than anticipated. The older the tree, the denser the fruit. This is consistent with what Agnes documented. She was learning the orchard the way Agnes had learned it, in sequence through seasons by paying attention to the specific character of the specific trees in the specific conditions of this specific hillside. October arrived the way October arrives in Wisconsin. Not gradually, but decisively. The temperature dropping across a week into the permanent cold that meant the season had shifted and would not shift back. The orchard was in its fall color, the leaves turning in the specific order that Nora had observed through September. The Baldwins first, and then the Roxbury russets, and finally the old tree at the far eastern edge, which held its leaves longer than any of the others, as if reluctant to let go of what the summer had given it. Nora drove to Madison on a Friday afternoon for the fair. She had brought 6 bottles in a wooden case she had made from pine boards in the equipment shed. On a Tuesday evening, the joints fitted carefully, the lid sliding smooth on its groove the way Agnes's original cases slid. She had labeled the case with the vintage year and the varietal composition and the farm name in her grandfather's marker, writing large the forward-leaning letters. The Heritage Agricultural Products Fair was held in a building on the university campus that was used for agricultural events. It was not large, and it was not formal in the way of commercial food events. The tables were plain, and the lighting was functional, and the people moving through the space had the specific ease of people who have come to pay attention to something, rather than to be seen paying attention to it. Carla DeVore met her at the registration table. She said, "The panel evaluation is tomorrow morning blind. The recognition ceremony is tomorrow afternoon. You do not need to be here for the evaluation. You should be here for the ceremony." Nora left the bottles with the registration staff and drove back to the farm. She was there before dark, which gave her time to do the evening chicken check and bring in wood for the stove and eat at the kitchen table with Agnes's notebook open in front of her, because she had been carrying it to the table in the evenings, the way her grandfather had carried his field notebooks to the table in the evenings. The habit of ending the day near the record of the day's work. She read the late entries again, the shorter ones, the ones from the final winter. She thought about the blind evaluators handling the 1991 bottles tomorrow morning, opening them without knowing anything about the person who had made them, or the orchard they had come from, or the 24 years they had waited in the dark of the cellar, under the kitchen where Nora now sat. They would taste what Agnes had made and record what they found, and not know whose hands had done the work. She thought that Agnes would have approved of this. The evaluation of a thing on its own terms without the weight of the story attached to it seemed consistent with the character she had assembled from 41 pages of production notes and the canvas apron and the careful wax seals in the sentence that ended without a period. Agnes had not needed her work to be witnessed while she was doing it. She had needed it to be done correctly. The drive to Madison the following afternoon took 2 hours on roads that ran through bare October fields, under a sky that carried the specific flat gray of a day that has given up on producing actual weather and is simply being November before its time. The recognition ceremony began at 2 o'clock. The room held perhaps 80 people, producers and society members and university extension staff, and the specific mix of observers that Heritage agricultural events attracted people who cared about what was being preserved and why. Nora sat in the third row from the back. She had not told anyone she was coming except Ruth Mercer, who had asked in September how the fair preparation was going, and had listened with the attentiveness of someone keeping track of something that mattered to her. She had not told Owen Briggs. Owen Briggs was the neighbor to the east, the 67-year-old who farmed the 2 sections along the eastern fence line and had been on that land for his entire life, his family having been in Rainier County as long as the Callaways had. He had watched Nora move through the farm since February with the specific quality of attention that long-term neighbors pay to changes in properties they have watched for decades. He had not said much to her. He had come over once in March to help her reset the fence posts along the east boundary that she had identified in her notebook, arriving at 7 in the morning with the right tools without being asked, and working alongside her for 4 hours and then going home without ceremony. He had said 3 things total, and all 3 of them were about fence posts. She had not told him about the fair. He was in the 6th row from the front when she found her seat. She did not know how he knew. She thought about the county network that Ruth had referenced, the way information moved through the specific social fabric of rural Wisconsin, not through announcement, but through the accumulation of observed detail. He had been watching this farm since February. He had watched a 19-year-old girl from outside the county come onto a piece of ground that had been her grandfather's and his grandfather's neighbors, and begin to learn it in the right order and the right way, with attention rather than agenda. He was a man who paid attention to that kind of thing. She understood that he had probably known Agnes. The ceremony began with remarks from the society's director, a brief history of the fair, and the principle behind it. Then the evaluators presented their panel results. 23 entries from 12 counties. 3 received formal heritage recognition. 2 received merit designations. 1 entry identified during the presentation only by its entry number until the name was announced had received the special citation, a designation given at the evaluator's discretion and not awarded in every year. In 12 years of the fair, it had been awarded 4 times. The panel chair said, "This year's special citation goes to an entry that demonstrated not only the quality standards of heritage designation, but the specific character of a product that has developed across time in a way that reflects both the quality of the original production and the soundness of the preservation method." The evaluating panel noted that this product represents an example of what heritage agricultural practice is designed to preserve, a method developed through patient refinement on a specific piece of land, using specific traditional varietals, producing a result that could not be replicated through modern methods on any other property. He looked at his card. He said entry number 14, Wisconsin Heritage Apple Wine Vintage 1991. Producer Agnes Marie Callaway. Callaway Farm, Renner County, Wisconsin. Nora did not move for a moment. She heard the name in the room the way you hear something that you have been waiting to hear without knowing exactly how you would feel when it arrived. Not Agnes Callaway, who had kept a locked room in a barn for 11 years. Not Agnes Callaway, who had died in December of 1999 before she could send 1 laboratory analysis to Madison to complete the work she had started. Agnes Marie Callaway. Callaway Farm, Renner County, Wisconsin. The full name read aloud in a room of 80 people who had not known it before that moment, and who now received it as the name of someone who had understood something worth preserving. Nora stood when they called the entry number and walked to the front of the room and accepted the citation certificate. It was a single-sheet, cream-colored stock, the society seal in the upper corner, the designation printed in the formal typography of official recognition, and at the center of it the words Agnes Marie Callaway and the vintage year and the farm name. She carried it back to her seat. She looked straight ahead for a moment and breathed. Then she looked toward the 6th row. Owen Briggs was watching her from his seat in the 6th row. He was sitting very still in the way of men who have learned that stillness is a form of presence. His hat was in his hands. He was looking at the certificate she was holding, and then he looked at her face. He nodded once, not slowly and not dramatically. A single deliberate nod, the kind that carries the weight of everything it would take too long to say. She understood that he had known Agnes. She understood from the quality of that nod that he had known what Agnes was doing in that room and that he had kept that knowledge for 24 years, as Everett had kept it with the specific loyalty of people who understand that some things are worth guarding because the person who built them deserved to have them guarded. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she nodded back. She drove home in the October dark with the certificate in a cardboard tube on the passenger seat, and the heater doing its partial job, and the fields on both sides of the Route 9, invisible beyond the reach of her headlights. She turned into the lane and felt the gravel under the wheels and came through the last curve and saw the farmhouse at the end of it, with the kitchen light on the light. She had left burning when she went out that morning. She sat in the truck in the yard for a moment. The barn was dark. The north bay door was visible in the yard light, the padlock still hanging open on its hasp, the way she left it now. The orchard beyond the east fence was a dark mass of bare branches against the slightly lighter dark of the October sky. She went inside. She put water on for tea and stood at the kitchen window while it heated. looking at the yard the way she had looked at it on the first morning in February when everything was still frozen, and she had not yet understood what she was standing in the middle of. Then she sat at the kitchen table. She opened the Agnes notebook to the last page Agnes had written. She read the final entry, the entry about the old tree with the split trunk, the hope that it would last another 90 years, the sentence that ended without a period, the line that trailed off into blank paper. She looked at the 30 blank pages. She thought about Agnes writing in this notebook. For 11 years, the daily and then weekly, and then monthly entries, the technical record that was also a testimony. The accumulation of a practice documented by someone who understood that documentation was a form of responsibility toward whoever came after. She picked up her pen. She wrote below Agnes's last line, not on a new page, but in the space below the last entry. The same space where the period would have been if Agnes had finished the sentence, because there was no clean break between what Agnes had been doing and what was being continued. Now only a gap of 24 years that was being bridged by the simple act of picking up a pen and continuing the record. She wrote the date, October 2022. She wrote the 1991 vintage received the Heritage Society Special Citation today. It is the 4th time the citation has been awarded in 12 years of the fair. The panel chair said it could not be replicated through modern methods on any other property. Agnes Marie Calloway, producer. She wrote, the Roxbury russets in the far row carried well this year. The fruit is dense. I pressed the first batch last week. The fermentation is active and forward on the tannin, the way the early entries describe. I did not substitute. She wrote one more line. She thought about it before she wrote it. Then she wrote it. She wrote, the old tree is still there. She put the pen down. She picked up the certificate from the cardboard tube and unrolled it carefully on the table. Agnes Marie Calloway in the formal typography of official recognition. Calloway Farm, Renner County, Wisconsin. The vintage year 1991 when Agnes had been in this barn in the February cold, pressing the first batch of a year whose apples had not yet told her what they were going to become. She carried the certificate to the shelf in the kitchen, where Everett had kept his field notebooks in their careful row. The notebooks were still there, his handwriting on the spines in his large, forward-leaning hand. She set Agnes's notebook back in its place beside them. She set the certificate beside the notebooks, leaning it against the wall so the text faced out. She looked at the shelf, the notebooks and the certificate and the space remaining on the shelf, for what came after them, the years of record still to be kept, the seasons of work still to be done, the specific knowledge of this specific farm still to be accumulated in the patient way that knowledge accumulates when someone decides to stay long enough to learn what a place has to teach. Outside, the Wisconsin October night pressed against the kitchen windows, and the old tree at the far eastern edge of the orchard stood in the dark, the way it had stood through every winter of the past 100 years. The split trunk healed into a single form, the branches carrying the structure that would produce again in spring, patient in the way of things that have been in one place long enough to understand that seasons end and begin, and that the work they enable is worth doing again each time. Nora made her tea and sat at the table under the overhead light that was older than she was, and opened her own green notebook to the next blank page. She wrote the date at the top in her own handwriting, which was different from Agnes's and different from Everett's, but which had been shaped, she understood now, by the same place and the same mornings and the same practice of paying attention to what the land was trying to say to whoever was willing to sit with it long enough to hear it. She wrote the day's observations, the temperature that morning, the condition of the orchard after the first hard frost, what the fermenting press was doing and what adjustments she was considering and why. She wrote what she planned to plant in the spring and what the south fence needed before then, and what she had noticed about the drainage on the east side of the back 40 that she wanted to watch through the winter. She filled 3 pages before she stopped, which was more than she had planned to write, and less than she had to say. And then she capped her pen and set it down, and looked at the shelf where the notebook stood beside the certificate in the kitchen light. The farm was quiet around her. The stove was burning correctly. The damper set the way she had finally learned to set it the fire, doing its patient work through the night. The chickens were in the coop and the orchard was in its October sleep, and the north bay was unlocked, and the cellar was as it had always been, cold and dark, and holding what it held. She was 19 years old, and she had been on this land for 8 months, and she did not know yet what she did not know, which was the condition of anyone at the beginning of something that has no fixed end. But she knew the tree at the east edge of the orchard. She knew the way the Roxbury russets behaved in the press. She knew the temperature that the North Bay held in February, and how the cellar smelled in October, and what the stove required to carry heat through the night, and what the south fence needed, and what the barred rock near the east wall of the coop had been doing last week, that she was watching closely. She knew the notebook on the shelf and what it contained, and what the pages before the blank ones had been saying, patient and specific, and addressed to whoever came next. She was the one who had come next. She turned off the overhead light and went upstairs in the dark farmhouse on the Route 9 property that her family had worked since 1979, and lay in the room that looked east toward the orchard, and listened to the October wind move across the Wisconsin fields outside, and thought about nothing in particular before she fell asleep, which was its own kind of rest. The specific rest of someone who has been where they are supposed to be and done what the day required, and has the next day waiting in the morning.